Yeah.
Now, there are three ways to control depth of field. A very, very likely midterm question is, what are the three ways to control depth of field? You guys, give me 5 more good minutes and you're good, okay? 3 ways to control depth of field. Let me list them for you first. 1, focal length of your lens. The focal length of the lens has a massive impact on depth of field. 2, working distance. And let me define working distance. Working distance is the distance between you and your subject. So if I were taking a picture of PJ here, she's only about 5 feet away from me. Working distance is the distance from me to my subject. As you either back up, meaning you move farther away from your subject, or as you move closer, so as you increase or decrease working distance, that has an effect on depth of field. I'm going to tell you what the effect is later. I just want you to write it down for now. So again, 3 ways to affect depth of field. Focal length first. So zooming in or zooming out. Working distance. In other words, moving closer or farther away. And then the third one, which is the one that we use most often, is f-stop, aperture. Opening or closing your aperture has a major impact on depth of field. Yes, most definitely. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on the first two. Do you have a question, Jasmine? Just stretching.
It was 3 ways of what?
Controlling depth of field. So if I wanted to get a deeper or a shallower depth of field, I could manipulate it by one of 3 ways. Focal length of the lens, working distance, or f-stop. Let me give you the general rules for the first 2. The longer the focal length, the shallower the depth of field. So the longer the focal length, the shallower the depth of field. Ron, can you turn the lights back on for me, please?
So
The more you've zoomed in. So if I've zoomed in, if I want to make the subject look really close and really big, that's great, but I've also massively decreased my depth of field. So if you zoom in, remember zooming in means changing the focal length. Zooming in means you're increasing focal length. Remember, we know as we increase focal length, we make subjects look closer and bigger, which we might want to do sometimes. Let's say I'm in an arson scene and I can't get very close to the building because it's on fire. I might zoom in so I can get the details. So zooming in means that I increase the length of my lens, and I therefore make the subject look closer to me and bigger. The problem with doing that, though, is when you increase the focal length by making things look bigger and closer, you actually decrease depth of field. Let me show you what that looks like. All right, so here are just 2 photographs of just a game, a set of chess pieces. This photograph, the one on the right, was taken with the normal lens, standard lens. Okay? So this makes the chess pieces look the way they're supposed to look. Remember, standard, normal makes things look normal. This photograph, the one on the left, was taken with a long lens, so zoomed in. So this one was taken with the lens at around 35 millimeters. This one was taken with the lens around 100 millimeters. Now notice as you zoom in, it makes the chess pieces look what? Closer and bigger. But also look at, remember, depth of field is how much is in focus. In this photo, everything's in focus, front to back. All the chess pieces are in focus. But notice as you zoom in, the subject, which is this big chess piece here, it is in focus. But look at these other chess pieces in the background. Notice that they are what? Blurry. So by zooming in, what happened to the depth of field? It shrank. The depth of field got narrower. So we don't typically like to control depth of field using lens. Now, if you do want to increase depth of field, by the way, you can zoom out. If you decrease the lens length, if you go to a wide-angle lens, you will get more depth of field. What is the problem, though, with decreasing my focal length? Yeah, everything looks really far away now. and it looks really, really small. So if I'm trying to capture small details, now I can't see them because they are too far away visually. So that's not a great way to control depth of field. Distance, second way, working distance. Here's the general rule. The closer you are to the subject, so the smaller the working distance, so the closer you are to your subject, the smaller the working distance, the less depth of field you'll have. Sure. The closer you are to your subject, so the smaller the working distance. So again, if I was taking a picture of PJ here, she's only about 5 feet away from me. If I moved closer to her, meaning that the working distance got smaller, you would begin to lose depth of field. So the stuff in the background would start to get blurry.
It'll still be shallow.
So it would still be shallow, exactly right. So by moving closer, yes, you do make the subject look bigger and closer, but suddenly now the background gets really blurry. Let me show you an example of that. So last semester I had a couple students, they were out messing around. They took some really neat photos of some flowers here on campus. Show you a couple of photos they took. So here's a great looking photo of a flower here on campus that was taken by a student. Beautiful looking photo of the flower. Now notice, to take this photo, you would have to get really close to the petals of that flower. So the working distance is what? The working distance is really, really short. Notice also all the leaves and the foliage in the background, it's all what? It's all blurry. So notice as you move close, all the background suddenly goes blurry. So that's not a great way to control depth of field either. Now you could increase depth of field by doing what? Backing up. But if you backed up away from this flower, suddenly now the flower gets what? So small, and you lose detail. So this is not also a good way to control depth of field. Of the three ways, what is the best way to control depth of field? Aperture. Aperture. I'm not going to give you the rule yet. I'm going to have you figure it out. Let me go back. Remember those photos of the birds I showed you earlier? Let's go back to those two photos. And this is what we'll finish with. All right, so remember we saw those photos of those pigeons in the park? Let's go back to those photos. Ron, would you turn one of the lights off for me, please? Oops. So looking at these two photos, okay, remember the birds, all right, to capture the birds in flight, what did we have to do with shutter speed? It had to be very fast, all right? Okay, so far so good? Now, in this photo, the birds are a blur, and that's because the shutter speed was slow. Okay. Now let's go back to this photo. Okay. I don't want you to focus now on the birds. I want you to focus now on the background. All right, so looking at these two photos, looking at the background, which one of these has, don't focus on the guy, because that kind of, but focus on the trees. I want you to look at the trees in the background. Which of these two photos has a nice and sharp and clear background? The one on the right or the one on the left? The one on the left. So the one on the left has a deep depth of field. The one on the right, the trees and everything are blurry because it has a shallow depth of field. Now let's figure this out. This photo, this one on the right, shutter speed fast or slow? Fast. Because the shutter speed was so fast, we lose light. So if you're losing light and you got to get it back, what do you do with your aperture? You got to open it up. Okay? But by opening the aperture, you had a secondary effect of doing what to the depth of field? Making it shallow. So here's the rule. The farther open your aperture is, the less depth of field you'll get. Good job critical thinking. I'm impressed, you guys. So the photo here on the right, the birds, the motion of the birds is captured because of the shutter. The shutter was moving fast, and so we were able to capture the motion of the birds in flight. But in doing so, we were running the risk of losing light. And so, in terms of running the risk of losing light, to compensate, you had to do what to the aperture? Open it up farther. But by opening up the aperture farther, what happened to the background as you opened up the aperture? You decreased the depth of field. Suddenly the depth of field got very, very shallow. So far, so good? We're almost done. So looking at our list, Ron, could you turn the lights back on for me again? Going back to our list of f-stops here on the board, okay? 1, 1.4, 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6. What is going to give me more depth of field? F22 or F2? F2 is not. 22. The more closed down the aperture is, the more depth of field you'll get. Right? So you guys, this is a lot of variables to shuffle around. That's why being a good photographer is hard, is you have to shuffle all of these variables at the same time. So in crime scene photography, do we want shallow depth of field or deep depth of field? Deep depth of field. Right? I promise I'm going to tie everything together in the next 3 minutes. We want deep depth of field. Okay? What gives us deep depth of field? Smaller aperture openings or wider aperture openings? Smaller. Because we want deep depth of field, we're going to have to keep our aperture closed down. Do you foresee a problem with that?
Yeah.
Every time you make a decision, there are positive consequences and there are negative consequences. What is a positive consequence of closing down your aperture when it comes to depth of field? You get more depth of field. Closing down the aperture gives you more depth of field. What is the negative consequence of doing that? You lose light. So think about crime scene situations. We have to handhold the camera, which means we're limited with shutter speed. We're already in a dark environment because we're taking photos at 9 o'clock at night and that drive-by shooting. We need a lot of depth of field, which means we need to keep our aperture closed down, which means we have very little light. So we get in situations that are very tough to average everything out. All right? But that's why crime scene photographers are the best photographers, because we figure it out. We figure out what is the best combination of shutter, aperture, ISO to give us the highest resolution picture we can get with the best depth of field and perfect exposure.
So,